I'm using my phone as I'm using my phone as a hotspot, so that should fix it.
I hear you well.
Can you hear me well and see me well?
Yeah, we can see you.
Great, thank you. So my name is Gemma Modinos. I am the chair of the Young Academy of Europe. I'm also a reader in neuroscience and mental health at King's College London. And it is my great pleasure to chair this mock evaluation panel on the life sciences domain. So first I'll start by showing you the screen to introduce the distinguished panel members that have donated their time to be in this role play that will represent how an evaluation panel for the life sciences work. So we have two grants that we will be evaluating. One was successful and one was unsuccessful. And the panel members will be discussing them in a role play for the next about 30 minutes. So we are very grateful to count with the expertise this afternoon of Professor André Aleman from the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, Professor Mara Dierssen from the Center for Genomic Regulation in Spain, Professor Mandy MacLean from the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow in the UK, and Professor Ole Petersen from Cardiff University in the UK. So these are very experienced scholars in this review process, and we believe that you know, as attendees, the insights into how this process works will be extremely valuable when you prepare your own applications. In the next slide, this has been actually already announced in the plenary session, so I don't need to go into too much detail, but just to remind or refresh our memories of how this works. There's the evaluation preparation when the grant is submitted. The panel chair will allocate the proposals to different panel members. These panel members at step 1 will review as generalists the part B1 of the synopsis and the applicant's CV and track record. From this panel meeting, there will be a recommendation as to whether this grant will be scored with an A, B, or C. A will be someone shortlisted, a proposal shortlisted to go into step 2, go into interview. And B and C are receive the comments from the panel, but will not be able to proceed with funding. And there are some restrictions for when the applicant can apply again, depending on whether it's a B or a C. We have one grant at step 1 that will be discussed today. And then we have a grant at step 2. This involves that besides the panel members reviewing the grant, there's also the panel chair sends this grant to external reviewers. And these external reviewers will also offer an evaluation of the grant, and there's also an interview. And together from all of this evidence, there will be a ranking of the proposals into either A or B. A, the proposal can be put forward for funding depending on the amount of the budget available that year, and B will not be funded. And you have this link here, which I will put in the chat in a little bit, from where all this information is taken. So at this point, I will stop sharing and I will move into the role play of today. The first grant that we will be discussing is a grant that this is again step 1, and it was submitted, no, step 2, sorry, and it was submitted to the panel LS8, which is Evolutionary, Population and Environmental Biology. The lead discussant for this grant will be Professor Mara Dierssen. So perhaps without further ado, Professor Dierssen, if you could introduce the grant and the science, because our attendees have not seen it. And the expert panel member for this grant will be Professor Mandy MacLean.
Yes, thank you very much. So the project is gene clocks, and the aim is to design and apply better methods for a significantly better resolution of phylogenetic trees, and also a significantly better estimation of the timing of the event the events in the tree, right? So mainly the project proposes a novel approach that was in fact coming from a previous paper from the applicant, in which he will use this horizontal gene transfer that will help not just to kind of estimate the differences or the possible contradictions between the species trees and the gene trees, which has been one of the main caveats in the field. So positive points are many, and I have to say first that the project in this second step, in which, as you know, we have also external reviewers that have a strong expertise in the field, it was reviewed by 9 reviewers. And this is because not everyone had the same views, so there were some contradictions. So I will explain the positive sides and also the negative sides, right? So positive points for this project was the originality of the method. In fact, this idea of using lateral gene transfer, even though it was published before, it will now expand, and it will now, let's say, take also into account like possible outgroup routing, let's say, the factors, right? And this is important because this was one of the main caveats in the previous methods. And the other thing is also that the applicant will develop divergence time estimation, and this will supplement existing temporal constraints in this horizontal transfer, right? So one of the good things is he has a strong experience. He has also a very good track record. He has also previously published methods in, so he already designed this probabilistic model of horizontal gene transfer and applied this model to analyze the phylogenesis of cyanobacteria. And in fact, this is one of his publications. And in terms of his profile, all the reviewers found him really competitive and very high level. The other thing that is also important is that, in fact, while being high risk in the ideas, is feasible because of the experience of the applicant. Okay, so in terms of science and of the scientific approach, all the reviewers agree that it is a good idea to use lateral gene transfer for addressing the questions that the applicant would like to address. However, there are also concerns. So one concern is that the applicant does not discuss the methodological pitfalls, right? So, for example, unequal evolutionary rate or sampling bias and so on. The second is that the applicant also doesn't discuss the possible problems in acquiring the genomic data that this proposal needs. So this is also a problem because even though the pace at which now we have this genomic data, of course, this has to be at least discussed, right, or presented. Then the other thing is that the demonstration of these methods to solve the problems and the critical methodological issues that are in the field has not yet been done, not even by him, because he only has this specific paper, right? So regarding his profile, there are some concerns also about his, let's say, the separation from his previous work and his previous collaborators. So a lot of the work will rely on these collaborators. And this means that even though of course, it's normal that you have a kind of a continuity with your previous collaborators. You should also very clearly show the separation of them, no? And I think this is one of the main questions that even though he received very high rankings by all the reviewers, but this is why we had to gather more opinions, let's say. So finally, regarding the proposed, let's say, future skills, what we know is that the applicant wants to develop his own group, his own independent group. However, the experience, for example, in mentoring young researchers is not very broad and is not very well discussed. So, and for example, this permeates into the proposal because the PI is not able to clearly define the roles and the skills of the different team members. So this is something that is also counting not very much in favor of the project. Finally, the project is very ambitious, but probably it would have been good to discuss the risk associated with the student's project, with the PhD student that he's planning to hire. So this should have been discussed in the project and is not, right? And even so, as I say, mainly the project is evaluated, and also I found it very original. I think that the PI has demonstrated independent and creative thinking. He has already gathered some independent funding, and he has also gathered a position, right? So, in fact, we think that in general, I think that the project, because of its originality, because the moving forward of the field, even if it's high risk, yes, but this is exactly what we would like to have in ERC project, right? So high risk, high gain, and this project would be certainly high gain for the whole field.
Thank you very much, Professor Dierssen, for that evaluation. I'd like to now give the floor to Professor MacLean for her evaluation. Please, Mandy.
Hello, yes, good afternoon, everybody. First, a caveat to this is I haven't been on a review panel for these grants before, but I have been continuously on UK Research Council grant panels for the last 10 years. So I can look at it from, a perspective of what is a convincing grant and what isn't, with a bit of experience behind me. And my other caveat is that this is not my field. So again, I can take a very objective overview of the grant with respect to the boxes it ticks and the way it's presented. So from a non-experienced person, I think the first thing that I could say was the abstract was very clear. And even though I wasn't in the field, I was drawn in, and it made me interested in reading on. And I think if you make an application interesting and easier for the reader to read, that's always a very good plus, because it means that they're engaged in what you're writing. And I found the abstract clear and interesting. Whilst I did find some of the text very repetitive, I did pick up on the general ideas, and I felt that the way that the grant was written was very, very clear. The applicant very clearly laid out what the problem was in very clear language. And then they very clearly suggested what the solution might be. And then very clearly set very clear goals about how they were going to tackle this solution. And these were framed in very specific questions and very clear ways how to answer each of the question. So I thought the way that the whole grant was laid out was very easy to follow and quite convincing in the way it was laid out. And then, of course, they go into methodology, which I can't comment on. It's clearly a very niche area, And the applicant's track record was very nicely laid out and clearly very expressed in a way that convinced me that they were tailored towards this work and very well qualified to, if somebody was to say, well, why do you do this work? Why should we fund you? I think they were very convincing in the way they laid that out. And there was a very clear record of funding in his field. He also demonstrated a good publication record and nicely showed that there was a progression from year to year. So this is clearly somebody who is in the up and up. He hasn't plateaued out. He isn't at the beginning of his career, but he's incrementally building a very good track record. And that was a clear thing that came over. The feasibility issue came up amongst the 9 reviewers, and I think he was very convincing. What I would say was it was very clear from reading further into this application that the problems that were identified by the reviewers were obviously very well addressed at interview. So clearly this person took on board, and this is important, if he clearly didn't argue with the reviewers, he clearly accepted that there were some issues that needed addressed, and he very clearly addressed these at the interview. So that's one good tip. It's not good to be defensive at an interview following one of these things. It's very good to accept that other people might see flaws and in a very constructive fashion tell the reviewers and the panel that's interviewing you how you defend that. And he's clearly done that in a very good way. He's also expressed why he's in a very good environment, and that's important. So he's obviously in an environment that's going to lend itself to this research. Yes, and he has listed a lot of collaborators. And this is either good, this can be a very good thing, because clearly one person can't do everything. And it's very valid to have collaborators in specific areas of work that perhaps you need expertise in that you don't have, and that's perfectly okay. And I think he's written that in a way that I could see that he was pulling on expertise. And to have collaborators is a good thing. It shows that you're building up collaborative networks across the world, which is great. So the reviewers were very supportive. I think they, more or less, most of them, there was only one that was a little bit out of line. And just be aware that you will always get a reviewer. We always call it reviewer 2. I don't know why it is, but reviewer 2 is usually always very negative. So you're always going to get a negative review, and don't let that dishearten you in any way whatsoever. That will always happen. And quite often, actually, you know, they're maybe making some constructive comments in there. But on the whole, the comments were, and the assessments were very good to excellent, nearly all outstanding to excellent comments. So obviously they covered the issues raised very well at interview. And I would just say one extra thing to everybody, that if you don't succeed the first time you apply for one of these grants, that's not the end of the world. That's part of being an academic and a learning curve. You have faith in what you're doing, you can reapply or apply elsewhere, and you very likely will get funded again. So if this is your first go at this and you don't get funded, please don't, you know, hang up the white coat. Keep on going, and you will get funded. Mm-hmm. So I think I'll just leave it there.
Great, thank you.
May I make a comment? Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mandy. I think it was very clear and accurate. I have 2 little things that I think are important, because as having been in those panels, and since this is the mock, like a panel, right? I think I have to comment that. One thing is that even though it's fine to have collaborators, if those collaborators are part of your former colleagues and so on, this might be seen by the panel as lack of independence or as not sufficient distance from your previous work, right? And this might be seen as lack of independency. So somehow it's not that you have to completely change your field, right? But it is that you need to show that you can really separate from your former colleagues and from your former work. This is one thing. The second thing is that, of course, there is always one or two, let's say, more critical people. In this case, I think reviewer 9 was also very critical. But those were the ones providing more arguments in scientific terms. So, as Mandy said, I think it's very important. The interview is the most important thing. I mean, there are some projects that are very good and fail in the interview. There are some projects that are not so good on paper, but then they clearly succeed in the interview. So the interview is the most important thing, not so much the presentation, but the discussion, right? And in the discussion, you will have these comments. You will have the comment of, yes, so how distant is your project from what you did previously? And in these terms, how you separate from your previous boss or your previous whatever, no? Project itself. Or, for example, some reviewers said, hey, this guy doesn't have a very good background, and as Mandy said, probably he solved this in the interview. So you have to be very critical with your own project, right? And very knowledgeable about what are the possible criticisms, etc. And in my view, having, for example, mock interviews and so on is very good, especially if you do with experts in your field, because these guys will be very critical. And what you need is critical people, not people that say, oh, everything is fine, right? So to prepare yourself for the questions, and also to sometimes be aware of some aspects that you may have not noticed. Okay.
Yeah. Great points. Thank you very much, both. So if we, just to make sure we have enough time for the next grant, but as panel chair again, we know that when these panels meet, it can be a whole day meeting, right? But if I asked you both to give a preliminary rating, of course, once we've gone through all the grants of today, we can also put them in context in the ranking. But if I had to ask you for a preliminary rating of this step 2 proposal, would it be an A or a B?
It would be clearly an A for me.
Yes, it would be an A for me as well. And on just one last comment is I would always get somebody to read your grant over before you submit it.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So for the attendees, you have seen how a grant that was put forward for funding is discussed. And now we're going to move on to the second grant, which is the Psychosis Grant. This was submitted to panel S5, Neurosciences and Neural Disorders. This is a step 1 panel meeting, and the lead discussant will be Professor Ole Petersen. So perhaps Professor Petersen, if you would like to introduce again the grant and the science in your opinion, since the attendees have not seen it. And the expert panel member will be Professor André Aleman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gemma. So we are dealing with a proposal with the title Dissecting the Molecular Pathway Linking Psychosocial Stress, GABA, and Psychosis. So you see, this is quite a wide-ranging proposal. Furthermore, we are dealing with a range of psychiatric disorders. Mentioned in the application is schizophrenia, autism, Tourette's syndrome, obsessive compulsive disorders, to mention several of these. In general, in terms of methods, we are talking about neuroimaging, computational neuroscience, cognition, learning, memory, emotions, speech. So it's a very broad area, clearly a very, very important area without any question. And the proposal is very much based as far as I can understand it. Like previous speakers, I am not actually an expert in the field, in this specific field. But what I see is that the proposal is very much based on the work on an animal model of psychosis. So these are rodents, right, treated with methyl azoxymethanol acetate. We'll just call it MAM for short, because it's too long to say that. And so that's the model that was developed principally, as I understand it, by Tony Grace in the US, and there's been quite a few publications about it in the early part of the 2000s. So the basic model, which sort of says that stress has an input to the prefrontal cortex that again affects the amygdala, that again affects the hippocampus, reducing GABA interneuron activity, increasing glutamate activity, which then again affects the striatum with an increase in activity of dopaminergic neurons and glutamate, which then feeds back into the midbrain with increased dopamine levels, which then again feeds back to the hippocampus, and then there's a kind of fortifying circle there. So the model is as such relatively clear. It seems that the work that has been done on the animal model is convincing. And it is stated early on in the grant that the principal idea is actually to translate these animal findings to humans. So that's obviously really important. So this is very much what we now call translational medicine. We have basic science findings, and now we need to understand, do these findings that have been established in rodents treated in a particular way, can they serve as a reasonable model for what actually happens in human beings? And the applicant indicates two principal aims. The first aim is to test whether the pathophysiological MAM findings are evident in patients in early stages of psychosis. So some of the changes that I very, very briefly outlined, do we find these same changes actually in patients in early stages of psychosis? And the second, also very important aim, is to test whether pharmacological manipulations that prevent expression of illness in the MAM model have comparable effects in subjects at high risk of psychosis. So to address these two aims, the project is split up in three sub-projects. The first one is more work on the rat model, particularly focusing on GABA. The second project is very much focused on stress GABA pathways in patients with psychosis, looking at glutamate levels, GABA binding in patients with first episode psychosis. And the third project is to test the effects of diazepam on the stress GABA pathway in subjects at high risk for psychosis. So in a sense, acute effects of benzodiazepine. So the proposal, and of course this is step one. So we have only seen the B1 part of the application. So I won't talk about the B2 at all, because as step one, nobody has seen that. So there are obviously inevitably maybe lots of detailed questions that subspecialists would want to address, but subspecialists are probably not present unless there was a particular lucky or, as the case be, unlucky case in the panel. Our sort of critical points that one has to be difficult as a reviewer and look for weaknesses. Coming from a rather generalist angle, I guess some people might question whether all these very different psychiatric disorders, whether they all kind of work in the same way, and whether this is a confounding problem. Maybe this is an unfair comment from somebody who is not a specialist, but it seems to me that that is not, at least in the B1 part, really clearly addressed, whether we can expect that all these very different psychiatric disorders will manifest the same different findings. And other a little bit critical points, I think, is some of the figures that are shown in the B1 part of the application. These are a lot of statistical figures. And again, it may be unfair because there are clearly different practices, different ways of expressing things in different fields, and I'm well aware of that. But looking at some of the graphs, I cannot help noticing that some of the effect sizes are quite small. They may be statistically significant, but the effect size is small, and that always begs the question, yes, you find something that is statistically significant, but is it, in a sense, actually meaningful? So that would be one sort of general question I would write. And if the proposal had gone on to step 2, I would have hoped that that would be a point that could be addressed. Also, some of the correlations that are shown are not totally convincing. You will remove 1 or 2 points and correlation to a large extent disappears. So these are sort of points that I'm a little bit critical of, but which perhaps a specialist might look at it in a different way. Now, in terms of the PI, which obviously is a very important part of the evaluation, factually, the evaluation is based on 2 equally important parts, namely the project and the investigator. And it's a good record. And in terms of the project, it is very clear that the investigator is very well qualified to deal with the project. And that's very important. So in that sense, there is no suggestion that this is somebody who is unlikely to be able to master all the different techniques that are there. The person has a lot of experience in all the different techniques that are required. And so that's a strong point. However, and this may be a controversial point that we will come back to later, I suspect, there are not papers in kind of top general journals. I don't see papers in Nature, Science, Cell, not even in PNAS. And for many reviewers, that will be at that level where we are looking for groundbreaking work by a PI who is supposed to be groundbreaking, then that is also something that could weigh against it. And that's also made very clear in the rankings by the 3 reviewers. We have a very small amount of reviewers compared to the grant that was just discussed, where we had 9 reviewers. Here we have just 3. And it is evident when you read these reports that none of these 3 people are extremely close to the field, because there is actually not a proper scientific evaluation of the grant. It's sort of general comments. One of them, and that may have a weight with the committee, I fear, is that because maybe it is B1 and is somehow taken a little bit for granted, I feel, in B1, that the animal experiments are needed actually. But somehow it's not totally clear why they are needed, because the main thrust of the grant is to translate animal findings that are already there into human physiology. And in fact, 1 or 2 of the reviewers specifically say that the animal work is not needed. And that will have had significant influence on the final outcome. So maybe I will stop there, because I already said a lot, and interested to hear what André Aleman has to say.
Great, thank you very much for that thorough assessment. André, Professor Aleman, would you like to provide your evaluation, please?
Yes, so this proposal has a few strengths and a few points that the reviewers highlight as weaknesses or drawbacks or critical points that they raise. And the strengths are the conceptual framework, which is novel, because in research in psychosis has been focused a lot on dopamine, but here the role of GABA and glutamate are emphasized and are put together in a clear, model in which you could explain the effects of stress in leading up to psychosis. And Then another strong point, I think, is the inclusion of animal research and translating it to human research, and also the inclusion of some pilot data that make it, that support the feasibility of this approach and of the measurements that that are planned. Then a kind of criticism one could give is that, actually it's not mentioned by one of the reviewers, but it's what I've heard this kind of criticism in panels, is that they're looking for really innovative, new ideas, groundbreaking. But if I see it correctly, the model that is used here and presented here was actually just published just before the grant was submitted. So in actually a general journal, Trends in Neurosciences. So it's a very strong model, and it is kind of novel because it was just before, but it's not novel in the grant, so to say. It's not novel going to be developed conceptually during that project. It is there already. The project is more a test of the model, which is also important, but in ERC, it's more also that the idea itself should be very novel. So it would have been good to go beyond the previous ideas and have an additional new idea or something like that. Then the superfluousness, I was thinking about that. So that's a comment of one of the reviewers that, which is actually in this phase a panelist. So that might be the reviewer does not explain why it is superfluous. It just says animal part is superfluous, no explanation. But that can be because in this phase, the panelist is there him or herself and can explain it, so they don't always see the need to explain it on paper, and they will explain it during the meeting. Now, so I was trying to understand this because I think the animal part is a strong part. But when I look at the aim as stated in the proposal on page 2 of the whole project, it says the aim is to test whether the mechanisms identified are evident in patients in early stages of psychosis. That's the first aim. So that's not about animals, that's about patients. Second aim is to examine whether this has comparable effects in subjects at high risk for psychosis. Again, humans. So actually the aims stated by the applicant herself are, the two aims are both about humans and not about animals. So in that point, the reviewer is right by saying, well, then the animal part is not needed. Also, if you look content-wise, the aim is to look at these GABA receptor binding in the patients, based of course on animal ideas, but even there you could claim that the animal part is not really needed. Personally, I do think the animal part adds a lot and makes it much stronger, but then it should have been maybe framed in a more logical way for the reader to follow the whole rationale and say, okay, yes, inevitable, we need the animal part. So that's one point. It's also a bit risky, the animal part. I would say no one says anything about it, none of the reviewers. But if the applicant herself does not have the experience in doing this animal research, that also is kind of difficult sometimes in the feasibility part. They say, oh yes, she's very experienced in the human brain imaging. They all say that, the reviewers, and very expert. But the animal part, she will need someone else to do it. It's not always said that it's not possible, but you should be careful. By mainly including studies and research that you yourself have a lot of experience in. And let me see what else. Yes, then of course the ratings are excellent and very good for the CV. And this may indeed have to do with the comparison within the panel with other applications. And if they have people, and as far as I've understood in life sciences, that's quite common, with papers in general journals, very high impact journals, current biology, science, nature, etc. Then your how do you say it? Your competitiveness may be a bit lower. And this is another topic that people can think about, which panel to submit your research, because this kind of studies in cognitive neuroscience or in psychiatry, in human studies, even if they are quite biological, they are also submitted to the SH4 panel. So that's in Social Sciences and Humanities. It's called the human brain and its complexity, the human mind and its complexity. And I was actually on that panel. And the chances, I think, of someone with this CV of getting there a project granted are larger, because there they don't look so much at the high impact journals and everything. They look more at the quality of the papers, and it's a bit less biomedical, so to say, more conceptual maybe. Well, in a way, of course. So yes, it's always difficult to know where can I submit the best and where do I have the best position to get my grant. Okay, that were my thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So if we did the same as before, if I had to ask both of you to give a preliminary ranking at this stage before we would have gone through all of the other grants, would it be an A, B, or C for this grant?
I would say a B.
I would say an A, but I don't have the comparison. And if in the other applications, this CV thing, is seen by the panel as very important, then of course it could have been a B plus or something like that. Yeah.
Yes, Mara?
Yeah, may I add something, because I was in the neuroscience panel, right? I think that there are two aspects that have been somehow mentioned, but let me just go into them again. One thing is the animal work. You said that it will not be done by you, right? It will be done externally, if I understood correctly, André. And this, of course, is a problem if the person is not experienced in animal work, because it may have seen as a, let's say, weakness of the project. The other thing is that somehow, taking into account that there have been some papers already around about GABA and stress and psychosis, I think that the project might have looked a little bit incremental. Having seen other projects in the neuroscience panel, people are really bringing kind of groundbreaking new ideas, both in the basic research field, but also in the translational research field. So things that are valued a lot is to what extent you are really bringing a new idea and a new vision. Right. So in this sense, I think that probably the message didn't go through. I agree with André that it was there, but I think it didn't go through, permeate through the panel. And probably it's very important the way you write things. I mean, you have to very clearly establish the state of the art and why and how you separate, and you bring something else to it, right? And for example, if we compare with the previous project, I think the applicant was really able to make this argument very clear, which probably was a little bit less clear in this proposal. So the other thing that I also wanted to highlight is that I totally agree with two comments, of one of Ole and one of André, about making a statement about too broad, like you will cover too many disorders or whatever, or at least you claim that this could apply, because this is somehow, when you try to be too broad and say, okay, it's not just my niche, I will be able to apply this to many other things. This is not a plus, it can be a minus somehow, right? And the other thing is that it's true that in some fields, the reviewers have a strong bias in the CVs for applicants that have made very strong contributions in some high impact journals, right? And I think neuroscience is one of those specific fields.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we are maybe already a bit into the debriefing, I sense, but I would just echo what also André says. The neuroscience panel is fiercely competitive. That's very, very clear. It's one of the, probably one of the toughest panels, because the neuroscience is very, very, very strong in Europe. And I didn't serve on the neuroscience panel, but on LS4, physiology, pathophysiology. But my son is actually chair of the neuroscience starting grant panel at the moment. So I know from him, I mean, there are papers, people who have papers in the neuron, nature, neuroscience, and so on, and are still deemed not to have high enough impact publications. On the other hand, I have to say, it is not totally up to the applicant which panel you go to. You may choose a panel that you think is easier, but there is a process which I think Gemma already outlined, where there is discussion between different panel chairs. And if a panel chair feels that that proposal is not actually appropriate to them, they will say, no, we are not going to take it because that's much more appropriate. So you don't have a free choice. You can try to steer it into something that you think is reasonable, but it's not a free choice.
Yes. Yes, thank you all. So we are indeed in the debriefing session. Thank you very much, the four of you, for reading these applications and providing your evaluations. It was also interesting to see how sometimes in the first grant, the two panel members agreed a lot, and in the second one, there wasn't, one was more favorable than the other, and I assume this may happen, and then of course, it begs to discussion, but I think it's important, something that when I attended one of these mock events for me was to see the importance of the lead discussant, which is not something we have a lot of control over, but we actually want to make sure that person is enjoying reading your proposal and wants to make a good case for it. And it could be any of the panel members, but having in mind that there's going to be someone who will be having a lot of weight into how that grant is presented is a good thing to keep in mind. And I will take some questions. I also wanted to give you a little plot twist, which is that I am the applicant of the grant that's not been funded. So if people have some questions about what happened next, the grant was rejected at that stage, but I had already submitted to two different other funding bodies in the UK, and it was funded by the Wellcome Trust and the Royal Society, which is a fellowship. And there's many things I could think of that made that change, how it was written, the application is different, what was emphasized, and I had the chance to be interviewed with some of the panel members, said it does make a difference as well. So please feel free to put your questions.
There are already a couple of questions, I think.
So Lisa, would you like to unmute yourself and read your question, or should I do that for you?
Yes, just a second. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I have actually two questions. I was just typing up the other one. So first was that you already slightly addressed about the journal impact factors, and you know, on one hand there's stuff that you read on Twitter, and you know, but it was actually very insightful to see that, you know, this is not actually what the how these things are taken at the panel. Is this just very specific to neuroscience, or is it any competitive fields, or is it just in case we should still all strive for nature and science publication, even if we think that, you know, this is not the kind of the message that we're getting from the instructions
I mean, there's no doubt that publications in these very tough journals, which of course is difficult to get your paper in there, and it does make an impression on people. There is no denying that. And it was always like that. I mean, it's not an entirely new phenomenon. I mean, I started out in research when there were no impact factors or anything like that. But there was still a difference between a paper in certain journals and in other journals, and people did take that into account. And I think it's not, yeah, I mean, strictly speaking, of course, one should read the papers and make up one's mind about it. But the reality is that panel members are very, very busy. and particularly in step one. I have to say step one is a dangerous one. There's no question about that. There's a bit of rough justice in step one. It may not be experts who read it. People have not had the full information. Many individual panel members have 40 or 50 projects that they have to talk to during step one. It's an enormous burden. And so people have not read it in detail. People do tend, I mean, that's what you get when you talk informally to people and you know them and they are honest about it. I mean, they will say that, yes, I mean, initially I look at the publications just to get a kind of feeling for what kind of applicant it is. So it does frame the kind of view you have before you actually even look at the application detail. It may not be very good, but I think that's the way it is. And there are clearly exceptions. There are clearly exceptions. I mean, the project may be so outstandingly original. I have seen that happen certainly in LS4 when I chair that panel, that people actually don't worry about the other thing. But you will notice, I mentioned it also, that evaluation, although most of the time is spent on talking about the project, the fact is that the evaluation says quite explicitly there are two equal parts in the evaluation of the investigator and the evaluation of the project. So even if there's not an enormous amount of discussion about the publication record, it is there. It's something that is very quick for everybody to look at. It can be made quantitative these days, and that's dangerous, obviously, because different subfields have different citation patterns, and we know all of these things. But it would be naive to say that it doesn't play a role. But I wouldn't say that I would advise people who don't have, I mean, it's not easy to get papers in Nature, Science, or Cell, or even in PNAS. So I wouldn't say that you should think that you can't submit an application because you haven't got such papers. But you have to be aware that compared to some people, and particularly in some panels, it may put you at a slight competitive disadvantage.
And in fact, I mean, we all are aware that this should not be a criterion that kind of dismiss a candidate or not. And that's all I was saying. Probably if you don't have such high impact record of publications, which may come simply because you did a postdoc in a great lab in which they have this production chain and you just went there. But I think that also other aspects like showing independence, showing creative thinking, showing also a kind of a very clear vision of where you want to go. This makes also a difference. And sometimes you have candidates with extremely good CVs that then fail because it's clear that they were there because they were in the right place in the right moment, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not something that you have to take as a go, no go, let's say. And what is really important is that the project is great, because then if your idea is groundbreaking, is original, it excites the panel, right? They will take less into account, as Ole was saying, no? Your CV. But in your CV, take into account also that there are other aspects that are very important. And if you cannot show independency, if you cannot show originality by yourself, then it doesn't matter that you have a very good record. It will not go through.
Mm-hmm. That's understandable. Do you mind if I ask another question, which kind of relates to that, or at least the issue that
I think
kind of...
Mandy also wanted to comment something. Sure. I now see that she has a raised hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the publication issue. I mean, clearly, you need to have a look at the policies of the research funder that you're applying to. So, for example, the UKRI councils, when we're sitting at panel, we're not allowed to make any comment on impact factors or publications, because that's considered unconscious bias, and we all go through training on unconscious bias. So what we're meant to do is assess the application that's sitting in front of us in terms of the science, and not then be biased towards making a decision based on the applicant's publications. you know, historically, yes, people, or very many people can count but not read, and so they will count good publications before even reading the science. But that's not a good way of assessing a grant, and I think most funders really appreciate that. That's not me saying don't strive to publish in high impact factors, but I wouldn't get too bogged down in it, because quite often people will publish in very high impact factors, but they'll be a mid-author, you know, and that's not as good as being a good senior author on perhaps a lesser impactful general journal, you know, because you're showing that you're leading the way. So yeah, I would just be a bit wary about getting too bogged down on, oh my goodness, I'm not going to apply for a grant because I don't have an impact factor of over whatever. I wouldn't worry too much about that. If you can show the application is excellent, the science is excellent, and you have published in relevant journals, and your papers are good and are cited. So that's all I would like to say on that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's also important to realize that the questions, and also what Mandy is saying, are developments of the last 2 or 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
So these grants we were talking about was like 5 or 6 years ago. And then it was still very common to look at age indexes, impact factors, etc. And now luckily it's every time a little bit less. But you still have, you know, if someone has only published in very, you know, mid-level journals, only of your own specific expertise, your own discipline, small discipline, only mid-level journals, it's very difficult to claim that you're so groundbreaking then, you know. So there is always a hierarchy, even if you don't look at the specific impact factors, there is a hierarchy. Like in a country, you also have leading newspapers and you have local newspapers. And, you know, there is a difference. And if you're a top journalist, you may publish every now and then in a leading newspaper. So you will always have a little bit this effect. I think even if impact factors would not exist, at least in my field, there will still be these journals that everyone knows because they publish their most important findings. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so it's a balance of, you know, if you're just publishing in good journals and you have an interesting and a good new idea, you should definitely go for it and submit a grant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an important comment. The other comment is also about the position in the papers, right? Because of course it's not the same being a first or a co-first, or even sometimes we even see in the neuroscience panel, we even see last authorships in big journals from applicants, right? This is what Ole was saying. I mean, it's really competitive. But of course, it's there is a bias also, right? When evaluating, for example, female scientists, so scientists that are females normally tend to negotiate less positions in the papers. And this is, of course, something that is not usually taken into account by the panels. And I think that if you can make the case that even if you are not the principal author of this paper, you were the one that really, I mean, if you can kind of argue this, let's say, leadership role, right? This is also important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. So I would like to ask our colleagues in the Academia Europaea Budapest Hub if we can go on for 5 more minutes just to answer the couple of questions in the chat, because I spent 10 minutes trying to connect to the internet at the beginning.
Yes, absolutely.
Great, thank you. I hope that's okay for the panel members, just 5 more minutes. So we have Eleni Farhadi. Would you like to ask the question, or I can do it for you?
Hello, hi. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. It's really helpful to hear you today. So one question is that some applicants, including me, for example, we are physician scientists. We are doing clinical work and we are also trying to do basic research in the lab. So again, my question is on the publication record. I'm wondering, when I'm going to apply for the ERC, should I mention my clinical paper that are completely irrelevant to the research that I'm doing? Can I include this in the publication record, or should I only include the relevant papers?
No, I think you can include all papers. There's no harm in that. Obviously, the application will make clear which ones are particularly relevant to the application. But I think given the enormous competitiveness of this, I think you cannot, if you have a strong paper in a strong journal and you are the lead, you cannot afford not to mention it, actually. It gives a picture of you as a person. So I would recommend include it. I mean, most people who are applying for starting grants don't have such massive numbers of publication that it is a problem to list most of them. You can be a bit selective, as was mentioned before by André, if there are a lot of middle author papers in sort of not particularly famous journals, maybe you don't necessarily need to mention them unless they are very important for the project. But if you have a strong paper, I would recommend that you absolutely list it because, as I say, competition is fierce and you have to show all your best attempts forward because you cannot afford to be modest, actually, in this world. That's one problem.
However, I would say, completing what Ole was saying, that if it's not a strong paper and you have too many,
sure.
Co-author paper in mid or low impact journals that are simply increasing, incremental, I would not put those. Because otherwise it's a lot of noise. If you put too many publications that are unimportant, or it shows that you cannot select what is important. So as Ole was saying, it's very important that you list there, even if it's not related to the project, your important publications and so on. But be careful in not overpopulating these, because with things that are, probably just descriptive or whatever, which is quite usual in clinical work, because of course you have a case that has some specific characteristics that might be interesting for clinicians to know that, hey, there is this case, right? But it's scientifically is probably not meaningful, right? So try to select what is meaningful in terms of either your own contributions to understanding, because also in clinicians' work, and I myself, I am an MD, so I know very well, you may end up with a lot of publications that are probably not very meaningful in terms of advance of knowledge, right? So I would try to avoid to make too much emphasis on those. Really show what you have contributed scientifically, right? In the clinical aspect.
Thank you. I got it. Thank you.
Thank you. We have the next question. I'm really sorry. I'm not sure I can pronounce your name well. Ayasu.
Thank you. That's okay. Yeah, it's called Ayasu. Yeah. So I've just returned from a very good lab, a very good postdoc in the US to Europe, and I have a position at the Research Institute in Europe now, but I don't yet have my own lab. So this is a position for one person only. And I know it's called a starting grant, but all of the successful starting grants that I have read were already they had 2 or 3 people already in the lab. So I'm wondering if that's a problem or how if I have to mitigate that in some way.
Well, starting grants are actually quite dealing with quite a broad range of publications. You clearly have to be on a clearly identifiable path to independence. That's very clear. But when I chaired the LS4 panel, we clearly had to divide the starting grants because some of them were from full professors who had already been running their lab for I don't know how many years. There's also a bit of a problem about the way ERC define starting grants, which doesn't fit everybody's career path. So you're not always comparing like with like. But the key point is, as has been repeatedly emphasized, that you can make it stick, that you are an independent thinker, and that you are not just transferring what your supervisor did to a new lab and just are going to do more of the same, because that's always the suspicion, of course. And there are people who come with fantastic publications. They've been to a top US lab and they have papers in all the right journals. And we have seen when some of these come back for consolidator grants that actually they didn't do well because they failed actually to really make an independent contribution. So it's very important. I think panels are very aware of that now, but I don't think you need to have been running your own lab for a long time. But as I say, you have to have a position that is very clearly on the path to independence, and you have to demonstrate intellectually that you are, as it were, on top. If you are successful through step one, then the interview becomes probably particularly important in this case, because you will have to convince people. I would also just like to say to the person from clinical medicine who was there a moment ago, that one of the biggest problems I had when chairing LS4 physiology and pathophysiology were that many proposals from clinical investigators did extremely well in step one. They had lots of papers in very high impact journals. But when it came to the interview, and particularly the discussion session, there were quite a few panel members who were a bit tough actually, and they asked a lot of questions about the basic science and about the methodology in the basic science. And some panel members really marked down people who did not know the details of all the different basic science methods that they had described. And this could actually really tilt things down quite dramatically. So you can win through step one by having kind of a very exciting proposal with lots of wonderful papers. But if you don't master the various techniques that you are supposed to supervise, it's not good enough at the panel discussion to say, this is something I delegate to one of my postdocs. That will, in my experience, not cut it.
Absolutely. And going back to the previous question, I'd say that I completely agree with Ole. You don't need to have, in fact, if you get an ERC grant, you will most probably have your own group. So you can build it from there, right? So it's absolutely not a requirement, right? But it's what Ole has said is very important. Your intellectual independence. This is the key. And that you can show that you have the ideas, you have the knowledge and the let's say ability to really move forward a field. That's the important thing.
If I can add something quick here, because I went through not the ERC interview, but yes, the Henry Dale, which is to start your own lab, 5-year, more than £1 million, so a similar thing. At the interview stage, I had the person leading the interview, then another expert, then a third surprise one came up. I was told I would only have 2, but I had a third one, specialist in a psychiatrist. And then when I thought I was done, and then the panel chair really grilled me on how I was going to be independent. So it is important. I didn't have my lab, and the getting this grant, it allows you to start your own lab. Even though it might be people in different stages. But the panel chair was really adamant because I wasn't moving institutions. I had already moved before. For my bachelor's, I was in Barcelona, and then I did my PhD in the Netherlands, and then I moved to the UK. So I even made a joke about I would happily move somewhere with better weather if I could do the research that I want to do somewhere else. But it was very important for them, how I was going to be independent, because I had publications without my PhD supervisor, but my postdoc supervisor, he's also my head of department, so it's quite difficult, really, and then I had to say that I did, which is true, that I had a grant and I had 2 papers submitted, and this was before preprint, so I couldn't even prove that, but I was really grilled on how was I going to be independent, and you have to emphasize the science, how your previous bosses have not really, they don't have any publications on this topic without you in them, for example. You really brought this to their institution, so now that you're coming back, I would try and make sure that you stand out from what the main thing that they are doing in this new lab that you joined? Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, for example, you can show this already in the proposal, because, for example, one of the criticisms to the gene clocks project that I was reviewing, right, was that the PI was not able to clearly define the tasks and the roles of the people he will hire. Well, he or she, I don't know, will hire, and also it was not clear that this project assigned to a PhD student is really something that a PhD can do, right? So you have to be very careful in really showing that even though you haven't have a group yourself, you really can envisage what would be the problems and what can be the solutions to that, right? And that you are aware of the, let's say, risks and so on. So what I would recommend to all of you is that you also have some professional development. There are a lot of courses and information in all the big journals, right? You can take a look on that, because these more kind of soft skills are also important. If you don't know that, well, a PhD student will be unable to do this huge amount of work in 3 years that you are proposing, then it will not work, right? And for people that do not have already these own groups, this might be important to show.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm wondering if it's time to wrap up now.
In fact, there is another question that I think is really, really important. Gemma, if we have two more minutes.
Yes.
That is Lisa Locke.
So would we recommend they contact the national contact point to discuss what would be the panel more appropriate, or what would you suggest?
I mean, in my experience, the national contact points help a little bit in other aspects, but not too much in this more scientifically driven aspect, right? And it's true, Lisa, that even projects that ask for 2 different panels are normally in a kind of vacuum that is difficult to fill. And what I can say is that, for example, in my case, in the neuroscience panel, those projects that are assigned to 2 panels are really, really difficult to evaluate. And this tends to kind of unfavor them, right? I don't know what is the experience of my colleagues, but in my own case, what I can say is that choosing 2 panels is normally not a good, not very good for the project, because none of the panels is completely expert on the field. And this goes very much into something that we all say on paper that we'd like to have, that is this interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary projects, but then nobody can evaluate those, right? So what I would suggest, but it's my view, is that you select the panel that would be more able to evaluate your project, and not try to go to the panel that you think would be more favorable to your project, right? Which is something that we also see, that people choose 2 panels simply because they think, oh, maybe I will get better in the psychology area or the whatever, right? The computational part. So I know that these projects will have a harder time. When I was in the chair of the panel, what we try to do is to have all the aspects of neuroscience research that can be evaluated. But of course, it's more difficult for these projects to go through. I agree.
Would you say it's more important to match the methodology to the expertise of the panel, or the questions, the big questions? Because because you would kind of think that the methodology is something that requires more expert opinion, while with the big questions, maybe that's something that is kind of easy to transfer.
We would always ask other panels' opinion, right? If we think that, for example, the methodology is something that we cannot evaluate, then we would ask the opinion of another panel, right? But if there is a strong emphasis on methodology, then for sure you have to go to the one that is more expert if you are developing a method or whatever. If there is a scientific question behind and you are kind of relying on a specific methodology that is not so much related to the field, then I would go more for the question. But it depends, right?
I think there are two aspects in step 1 and step 2. And step 1, the main aim is that there are people who are interested in the project in a general sense. The methodology is perhaps not that important because there may be no specialists there. But of course, when you come to step 2, the situation changes. And then there is a lot of emphasis on the details and whether you actually master all those details. So there's a kind of balancing out there. And step 1, the fight is simply to hang on, as it were, so that you can move on to the next step. And there's the interest of the panel. I think in general, in all walks of life, it's the same with submission to journals, grants. There has to be somebody who is interested in it. That increases enormously the chance of being favorably evaluated. And if nobody is interested, then it comes to the margin. And we should remember that it's not an absolute judgment. It is a relative judgment. So everybody has their favorite grants. And then they have a lot of grants that they don't feel very strongly about. And these are the ones that can just be frozen out because there are too many grants that many panel members feel strongly about and that they really want to promote. So that's a danger if you send something to a panel where there may be some specialists, but they're not really interested in the issue. You could be marginalized and you will never get to step 2.
Yeah, that's true. And in fact, when you go to a panel, mainly if you can make the question in a way that is interesting for the panel, that's the most important thing. But what I was referring to is that if it's a methodology project, like the one that was funded in our panel, right? Here in the mock panel, this was a methodology thing, right? So if you don't put this method in the right panel, in the panel that can understand this methodology, then of course you will not get through, right?
Yeah.
Makes sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So with this, we will conclude our Life Sciences mock evaluation panel session. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining, especially to the 4 panelists for all the wisdom that you've shared with us this afternoon. I hope, and I'm absolutely confident this will be instrumental for the attendees that want to apply for the next round of starting grants. And also thanks to the Academia Europaea Budapest Hub for their technical support. And I wish you all the best to all of you applying for an ERC Starting Grant or similar grants in the future. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.